This is a nationwide program, and everyone that takes part in the same series around the country studies the same topics. You'll note inside of your programs tonight there's a little ballot on the topic, and if you would like to fill that out and put it into the ballot box on your way out, this would be great. Everything is compiled and sent to President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton. We'd like to thank our evening sponsor tonight, the Thomas M. Cooley Law School. I would like to introduce the president of the school. President LeDuc is here with us. If you could please stand. Thank you very much. Also this evening, our media sponsor is Michigan Radio, so let's give them a warm thank you as well. And I would like to introduce Paul Carrier from Cooley Law School, who will introduce this night's speaker.
Good evening, and thank you for coming tonight. Cooley Law School has been a member of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan for 6 or 7 years now, and has sponsored nearly that many speakers for this lecture series. On Cooley's behalf, I have been honored to assist in searching for these speakers. This year, an issue of great importance to me was on the list, and after research into experts on global governance, I asked our president, Don LeDuc, and Dean Bill Weiner if we could sponsor tonight's expert, Dr. Stewart Patrick. Tonight's issue is of great importance today and in the foreseeable future. With cross-border terrorism, global warming, international health and water crises, international monetary crises, civil and political unrest around the globe, human rights violations, and other global problems on the rise, and believe it, they're on the rise, it has never been more important to take a long, hard look at the international institutions created to address these problems. These include the United Nations, NATO, the International Criminal Court, the World Health Organization, and myriad others. Add to this the growing number of developing nations who seek a larger role in all of these institutions, particularly but not exclusively China, Russia, Brazil, and India. Our expert, Dr. Stewart Patrick, will be touching on many of these issues and some of these nations this evening. Dr. Patrick graduated with a bachelor's degree in international relations from Stanford University, was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, has a doctorate and 2 other master's degrees, has worked at the State Department, and is currently Senior Fellow and Director of the International and Global Governance Program at the Council of Foreign Relations. He has published numerous books and articles on a variety of international and global governance issues. Would you join me in welcoming tonight's expert, Dr. Stewart Patrick?
Well, thank you very much for that extremely. Are we doing okay? I've got a BlackBerry. Do I have to put that away, maybe? Okay. I want to thank Paul for that extremely generous introduction and for the opportunity to be able to be here with you tonight. I want to thank Ellen Levy, the Great Decisions Committee Chair, and also Dixie Anderson for making this possible. I've never been to Grand Rapids before, but have had a wonderful day here, including a tour of the Ford Library, which brought back some very colorful memories of my being about 10 to 12 in Washington at the time with some parents who were very interested in those events. So it's a wonderful privilege to be able to speak to a great crowd and people who are interested in the role of the United States in the world. This evening, what I wanted to do was to focus on 2 major questions. The first, and they're big picture questions. The first is, what is the state of contemporary global governance, and what are its prospects for multilateral cooperation in addressing the most daunting challenges that we face around the world today? I'm going to look back when I do, as I talk, I'm going to actually look back to an experience, a historical experience of U.S.-led world order building that I recently wrote a book about. The book is called The Best Laid Plans, the Origins of American Multilateralism and the Dawn of the Cold War. And it looks at the decade of the 1940s, which was perhaps history's most celebrated decade of institution building, and obviously led very much by the United States. I want to think about what happened then, and then think about how some of the challenges that are confronting the Obama administration are a little bit different, and hopefully be able to leave quite a bit of time for questions. Now, global governance is a slippery term. It's controversial in a lot of circles, so I want to be as precise as possible. I do not mean global government, that is some big overarching political authority armed with black helicopters. I should say that since I do work at the Council on Foreign Relations, we do have black helicopters, but we rarely release them. It's actually funny, on our intranet website, there's a whole little sort of button. It's called Conspiracy Theories to find out what we're actually up to. But what I mean by global governance actually is something much more practical and something that's essential for the pursuit of U.S. national interests, and that's the pragmatic effort by sovereign independent states to come together in the absence of world government, which nobody really wants, to come together to address common challenges that transcend national borders. Global governance is just the term of art for a complex array of different international rules, multilateral institutions, and partnerships and networks that can contribute, hopefully, to effective problem solving at the global level. Now, why should this interest us? Paul began to get us in that direction, but by and large, everywhere we look these days, we see what appears to be a yawning gap between the demand for effective international institutions and their effective supply. Take the global financial crisis, for instance, where the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the big international financial institutions, were largely MIA at the beginning of that crisis. The G8, the group of 8, lacked the horsepower and the right groups or membership to do anything. And the UN was effectively irrelevant, although it wanted to play. Or think climate change, for instance. We've had now a couple of big summits over the past couple of years. Copenhagen, huge multi-stakeholder summit, and then more recently Cancun. But there's been no real progress in negotiating a successor to the Kyoto Protocol on global climate change, nor has there been much success in getting countries, advanced countries, particularly the United States, to agree to binding emissions reductions. Whatever one thinks about that, there's no question that if one believes in the pace of global warming, that international efforts are lagging. And then consider nuclear nonproliferation, for instance. There's a nuclear nonproliferation treaty, a whole bunch of other institutions that help try to hold up that regime, but it's suffering from body blows from rogue states like North Korea in particular, and also in particular Iran. It's also under threat because of the great spread of interest in nuclear energy all around the world, and with dual-use technology, that becomes a problem. And then, of course, there are non-state actors, terrorists that would just love to get their hands on the world's most dangerous weapons of mass destruction. So creating new and resilient frameworks of international cooperation, I argue, is going to be an enduring and defining task of the 21st century. A couple of observations about the global landscape that we confront, just to get started. First, I think it's worthwhile noting that the major threats that we confront in the 21st century are historically somewhat different than those that preoccupied us during the 20th century, when the main focus was on managing the balance of power amongst great powers. Now, that hasn't disappeared entirely. We've had a little bit of our frictions with China over the security of East Asia and the South China Sea, et cetera. We are getting worried about what Russia is doing in the Caucasus, and they're worried about expansion of NATO, for instance. But mostly, the issues they grapple with us are transnational problems about managing mutual vulnerabilities that are created by global interdependence. Thanks to globalization, rapid technological change, the accelerating velocity and swelling volume of transactions around the world, we found that formerly localized problems can easily transcend national boundaries, whether we're talking about terrorism, financial instability, cybercrime, global pandemics like swine flu or whatever comes next, or the proliferation of WMD. And the message that I would say here is that if we don't get better at managing globalization, it is going to manage us in unpredictable and often unpleasant ways. The second thing that we know about the international order is that it's shifting dramatically in terms of its distribution of power. For the past 2 centuries at least, the main weight of political and economic power in the world has been focused quite squarely in the Western world, specifically North America and Europe and their offshoots. This is changing abruptly. In 2010, nearly half of all global GDP, that's 49%, was produced by developing countries. By 2030, it's going to be nearly 60% of global economic activity is going to be produced in developing countries. And a lot of this is happening in dynamic emerging market economies, China, India, Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, and others. 90 to 95% of population growth will also be occurring in the developing world. And historically, we know that economic and demographic power or trends tend to translate into geopolitical power. But what we've seen is that many international institutions remain mired in the past. Some have adjusted a bit, but most are mired in the past. And the most obvious, I think, is the UN Security Council, whose permanent membership has not changed since 1945. And so we risk making do with creaky, obsolescent institutions that are both ineffective and also lack perceived legitimacy. So what about historical analogies? Can history help us at all in any of this? In thinking about prospects for sort of a new era of global institutional reform, people have started to look back at the generation of the 1940s, the sort of famous institution building that happened under Presidents Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman with significantly bipartisan support of the U.S. Congress, not least Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, who said after Pearl Harbor that it had eliminated isolationism as any option for anybody who was a realist in the world and one had to be an internationalist. And I think it was thanks to some very firm bipartisan support that there was a consensus during much of the Cold War about U.S. national interest and the importance of international institutions. And so this is when one saw the great institutions being built, whether one refers to the United Nations or NATO or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is a forerunner of the World Trade Organization, or the international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions. So how did the United States engineer these changes, and are there any lessons for today? I've written a book on this topic, which you're welcome to buy. Again, The Best Laid Plans. And I'd like to give you just a very brief overview of the book, and then which will either tempt you to buy it or make that irrelevant since you already know what it's about. My central argument is that few developments in 20th century world history were as pivotal as the choices that the United States made during the 1940s, when U.S. grand strategy, if you will, changed abruptly, and it changed abruptly twice. First, during World War II, the United States abandoned its traditional isolationism and penchant for unilateral action to embrace liberal internationalism and multilateral cooperation. And then in the early Cold War, when its dreams of one world were dashed, it resurrected or applied that same multilateral vision, by and large, to defend a narrower free world community. The book asks 2 questions. Why, at the height of American power, would the United States choose a grand strategy based on liberal multilateralism? And second, how did the Truman administration adapt this vision as this one world collapsed into 2? I want to emphasize that there was nothing inevitable about U.S. choices during the 1940s. In 1945, the United States had unmatched power and prestige and unrivaled capacity to shape the rules of global order. But that didn't dictate the purposes to which the United States put its power. And one can think about this if you do this sort of counterfactual thought experiment and imagine if instead of the United States, the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan or even Great Britain, Imperial Great Britain, had actually emerged from the Second World War as the world's most powerful country. The rules of global order would have looked much different. And one could even have imagined the United States retreating to a hemispheric shell or trying to impose unequal bilateral treaties on other countries around the world. But that's not what it chose to do. Historically, the United States had avoided entanglements. There was a huge Donnybrook over the League of Nations debate at the end of the First World War. Yet suddenly, during World War II, the U.S. assumed global leadership, sponsored multilateral institutions to govern security, political, and economic relations. And the goal of this effort, I argue, was to create an open world, a rule-based global order in which countries cooperated to advance common purposes. And I attribute this to a number of factors, including America's liberal political culture, which inclined US leaders to try to project onto the international system a vision of a community under law internationally. It also had to do with lessons, perceived lessons of the Great Depression and the Second World War about the preconditions for political and economic stability in the world, the need for collective security and the need for largely open and unfettered commercial activity. I argue that what's remarkable about this is the degree to which the United States actually clung to this vision when the Cold War broke out, as I said, when one world broke into two. America's post-war planners had presumed that the United States and the Soviet Union could actually find common ground on the rules of world order. But when this was dashed, the United States set out to create a free world community. But far from abandoning liberal internationalism, it adapted to new circumstances, retaining a consensual and egalitarian, generally egalitarian approach to world leadership in a way that another dominant country might not have done. And I argue that despite a lot of difficulties in application, the US approach had a lot to recommend it and bears thinking about today. It was a hard-headed version of liberal internationalism that was consistent with US political culture. It was informed by history. It was calibrated to achieve US interests, but it also was conducive to not just leadership, but also followership, bringing others along. And I think overall the experiences of the 1940s teach us about the value of investing in international institutions, because the order proved to be enduring and ultimately helped win the Cold War. It also testifies to the importance of being able to compromise with lesser partners, countries that aren't as strong as you are, but sometimes ceding a little bit power to lesser countries so that you could get them to go along with you. And then finally, and importantly, in our current environment, it testified to the pains of trying to forge bipartisan consensus for sustained US engagement. And the choices that the United States made during this period had enormous, enormous consequences. And one of them was that they led to the proliferation of multilateral institutions and international regimes that came to govern and to help regulate a vast array of different human activities, mostly for the good, because they created predictability and allowed and took away uncertainty and allowed countries to cooperate on common interests. Now, let's fast forward to today. The challenge today is to try to adapt this Western order, to update it to a new world, to the emergence of new challenges, and to the rise of new powers. Now, obviously, the election of Barack Obama amongst Democrats and liberal internationalists, really struck a chord, and they thought, well, based on what he said during the campaign, he's obviously going to lead an effort to rebuild alliances and institutions around the world. I mean, after all, he lionized the generation of Harry Truman and George Marshall as people who understood that institutions, rather than reducing American power, actually magnified American power. He's trumpeted a new era of global engagement. And in his national security strategy, which was released last May, focused incredibly heavily on the need to integrate today's rising powers into pillars of a rule-based international order. And I think, from my perspective and from the perspective of the lessons of the book that I wrote, these are they're laudable instincts, I think. But there are at least 6 big obstacles to sweeping global governance reform, which I want to speak about tonight. The first and probably most obvious one is the US lacks anywhere near the overwhelming material and ideological advantages it enjoyed during the early post-war period. You can overdo this, of course. The United States still spends militarily more than the rest, or as much as the rest of the world combined, which is extraordinary. The United States is the only country that can play in a meaningful way in every single region of the world. But if you think about things economically, we're much more vulnerable. Our economy is smaller than that of the European Union. In 1945, we were the world's indisputed economic powerhouse. We were responsible for most of global credit. Today, we are obviously the world's greatest debtor. We are relying on China to sustain the dollar's role as the main reserve currency and to uphold and to finance our massive deficits. And you could see the impact of the decline in U.S. power to actually get things done internationally, both at the Toronto and Seoul summits of the G20 this past year, when other countries basically ignored President Obama's pleas about the need to have more fiscal stimulus and also the need to deal with China's currency imbalances. The United States, though, has also frittered away a lot of its soft power, and this is this sort of intangible halo that has often gone with American power, the attraction of our ideals, of our vision, and of our domestic institutions. President Obama has a certain amount of personal appeal abroad, but that halo doesn't necessarily translate to the United States. And it's a little bit, it seems quaint sometimes to think about Clinton era slogans of, the United States is the indispensable power that stands taller and sees farther than other countries. A characterization that always used to annoy the Europeans anyway, but you don't hear it much anymore. U.S. leadership is no longer taken for granted, I would say, even within the West. And the U.S. economic model has been widely discredited around the world in the wake of the global financial crisis, which after all started in the epicenter of global capitalism, the United States of America. So there's a lot of skepticism also about U.S. democracy promotion. So on the power aspect of things, the U.S. is not in the same position. The second issue is that global governance reform is harder because there just are a lot more players, and there's a much more intrusive international agenda than there used to be. And that complicates coming up with new multilateral rules of conduct. At Dumbarton Oaks and Bretton Woods, the institutions that were created, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, they basically reflected negotiations between the United States and the United Kingdom, and in the case of Dumbarton Oaks, the UN with the Soviet Union. But achieving global governance is much tougher today because you have all of these players, and there's a diversity of opinion that they have. President Obama actually noted this in the April 2009 G20 summit in London. He said, hey, don't compare this to Bretton Woods. They were building an entire architecture. It's a lot easier when it's FDR and Churchill sitting down with glasses of brandy and hashing things out. It just doesn't work that way anymore. But today's multilateral agenda is also a lot more complex. It used to be that trade was about, let's reduce tariffs and get rid of some non-tariff barriers. These days, it's about regulating private actors in capital markets, hedge funds, and insurance companies. And also think about global collective security. It's not just about the balance of power amongst major countries. It's also increasingly about the management of transnational issues that requires incredibly intrusive mechanisms. So the Chemical Weapons Convention, for instance, the United States is a party to, allows foreign inspectors to come into our country to look at through our chemical plants, which raises all sorts of intellectual property issues as well as sovereignty issues. But it's a reciprocal relationship. So, we've given something up to be able to get stuff in other countries. So balancing the intrusive nature with our sovereignty is also difficult. The third thing that makes it difficult is that the world is no longer a blank slate. Now, after 1945, we pretty much had a tabula rasa, right? There weren't that many international institutions, or they had been destroyed by the war. So the victor powers basically had a free hand to create an order reflecting their interests, preferences, and power. But that's not true anymore. Between 1950 and 2000, the number of international institutions went from under 100, intergovernmental institutions, went from under 100 to more than 6,000. And there was a sevenfold increase in the number of multilateral treaties in force for the United States. So what you have actually now, and also I should mention, there's been a huge proliferation of regional and sub-regional organizations, which are extremely important and growing in importance as complements, but sometimes competitors to these universal treaty-bound organizations. So the upshot is what Frank Fukuyama calls a world of multilateralism. You got this bewildering landscape of different institutions. You're not sure which one should apply in each particular case. And that institutional diversity isn't all bad. I mean, sometimes a new innovative institution can give some tired old institutions a little run for their money, get a little bit of comparative advantage going, and that can be a good thing. It can allow the U.S. to do a little forum shopping, going with the institution that seems to do things well, but it can also produce some incoherence and duplication of effort, and also raise some dilemmas of legitimacy, accountability, and transparency. Now, President Obama has rightly said that the challenges of the 21st century can't be met without collective action. But I think what the administration needs to do a little bit more thinking about is if it's not about unilateralism versus multilateralism, what kind of multilateralism are we talking about? And the Bush administration here actually, I think, pioneered some interesting ideas. They were very skeptical of formal international institutions like the United Nations, you know, really slow, lowest common denominator type things, you know, subject to paralysis, subject to consensus. And so they started to experiment with what one would call minilateral cooperation. Create coalitions of the willing, a la carte coalitions of the willing. Don't just use the prefix menu, right? You know, yeah, go a la carte too. And the idea there is you could tailor these things to like-minded countries and work with them for specific instances, and then the coalition maybe could disappear. And there are generic advantages to both approaches. And I'll give you a couple of examples to date, because I think this is the wave of the future. The key is to try to make these things complementary rather than undercutting of each other. But one example is from the world of nuclear nonproliferation. So the US supports the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty. It supports the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the work that they do. But at the same time, you know, during the Bush administration, they created something called the Proliferation Security Initiative, which is a group of countries, started with a core group, that said, look, there is fissile material and weapons of mass destruction technology being, you know, transported all around the world, some of it by this Pakistani guy, A.Q. Khan and his network. We got to stop this stuff. So let's, without creating a whole treaty, let's just get a bunch of people to agree on how we're going to interdict this stuff. And they've had a bunch of interdictions. A lot of them, it's all classified, so, you know, how are they doing? We don't really know, but hopefully will. So PSI, Proliferation Security Initiative, has gone alongside these other mechanisms. If you think of climate change, you get something quite similar. You know, there's been a lot of frustration. I mentioned, you know, Copenhagen and Cancun. There's a lot of frustration about these sort of big UN mega conferences, totally chaotic, not exactly conducive to negotiating, you know, painstaking text, et cetera, when, you know, NGOs, everybody else descending on the scene. Because of that, under the Bush administration, but then continuing under the Obama administration, there was a decision to group the 17 major emitting economies, which what the Obama administration calls the Major Economies Forum, to try to push certain breakthroughs with the countries that really, really matter. Now, they're not necessarily the only ones that matter in terms of the effect of climate change, but they're the ones that matter in terms of whether or not emissions are going to continue at the same volume and at the same pace. So, as I said, there has to be ways to try to reconcile these two forms and make complementary these two forms of multilateral cooperation. The fourth area, which I think is difficult, is that adapting institutions to major power shifts has proven to be extremely difficult. You know, as tough as it is to create new institutions out of whole cloth, it's even harder to reallocate power and authority within existing institutions, much less, I mean, it's almost impossible to eliminate existing ones. They just live on forever. You know, they're the undead. Very rarely do they go down. There are very few that are set up with sunset clauses, you know, of 20 years. They just remain forever on life support. But you can't really, it's very hard to reallocate power within them because of vested interests will fight tooth and nail against any dilution of their privileges. And we see this dynamic and I would say that the more important the organization is, the greater people will fight tooth and nail. So we see this dynamic in the UN Security Council, for instance, where, you know, any suggestions to Paris and London that perhaps the French and British Security Council's permanent seats might be merged, say, into a one European Union seat doesn't exactly meet with resounding applause. But you also see it more generally. None of the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, is willing to countenance either getting rid of their veto or, even if there were other permanent members brought in, extending the veto to them. So they jealously guard their prerogatives. Or take the International Energy Agency. A lot of people don't really know that much about it. It was set up in the mid-1970s, basically to deal with the aftermath of the Arab oil embargo and the oil crisis of the time. It's largely a group of energy consumers. Now, what's crazy is that India and China and a bunch of other emerging countries aren't members of the IEA. And the ostensible reason is, well, you got to be a member of the OECD, you know, the advanced industrialized, you know, democratic world. But there's another reason, which is maybe as important, is that the quota shares in voting within that organization are pegged to oil consumption in 1974, right? Okay. So during that time, OECD, advanced world oil consumption, has largely been static, right? I mean, India's has increased sixfold, and China's has increased eightfold. So, you know, if you bring them in, you're definitely changing the prerogatives there. Certainly, major institutional change can happen, but it tends to happen in the wake of a major crisis. And a crisis of at least pretty large proportions was obviously the global financial crisis. And here we've actually seen some changes in global economic governance. You know, we've seen, in particular, the Group of 20 emerge as the quote-unquote premier forum for global economic coordination. We've seen also the creation of something called the Financial Stability Board, which is supposed to bring some sanity and harmony to the different financial standards of different countries and to reduce what they call systemic risk in the global financial system. And we've also seen some modest reformation in the so-called chairs and shares debates that have been longstanding in the World Bank and the IMF. And that, just in a nutshell, means that there has been some movement to give some of the chairs on the executive boards of those organizations and also reallocate the voting quotas in the interest of developing countries. But by and large, there still is tremendous resistance to global institutional reform. And so I think we have to just get used to the fact that there's not going to be a revolution or transformation unless there's a cataclysm, and hopefully there's not going to be a cataclysm. We have to get comfortable with incrementalism when it comes to global governance reform. And the pattern often, because it's the path of least resistance, is just create new organizations. So the way I like to think of it in an urban planning model, it's like it's suburban sprawl is going to be more common than urban renewal. You know, you're not going to go back in and try to, given how urban renewal worked, this may not be a very attractive analogy, but I think you get what I'm saying. The fifth major obstacle to global governance reform is that integrating new powers into established Western-dominated order is going to be vastly more difficult than I think a lot of people imagine. In the 21st century, I think it stands to reason that prospects for effective multilateral cooperation are going to depend heavily on mutual accommodation between the world's rising powers and the world's established powers on the basic rules and norms of conduct and the basic responsibilities inherent in power. And the rapid emergence of China, India, and Brazil and others is testing the institutional foundations of the post-war order. Now, in approaching this question, the Bush administration, with respect to China, spoke of trying to make China a quote-unquote responsible stakeholder. And that meant a country that would do things like enforce intellectual property law, be a good citizen when it came to nuclear non-proliferation, in part by pushing the North Koreans a little harder than they had been, et cetera. The Obama administration has basically adopted this entire framework, although they don't call it that because administrations don't like to use the same words as the administration that went beforehand. But they basically have said, look, we want to integrate these countries as responsible. We want to cultivate them as responsible countries. But there are a bunch of challenges here, and I outlined some of these in a November, December issue of Foreign Affairs. One of them is that the challenge of integrating rising powers isn't just about giving them power and weight within institutions. It's actually about whose rules and values will govern. And increasingly, it becomes clear that rising powers do not always share Western views of global order. All of today's rising powers are at least mildly revisionist. I mean, none of them is revolutionary. There's not like a Maoist China or I mean, unless one goes to a sort of Iran, a Maoist China or sort of a Bolshevik Russia out there. But all of them want to test and dilute existing rules. They want to be rule makers, not just rule takers, and they think that the existing order in many ways is stacked against them, whether it's the trade regime or the non-proliferation regime or the climate regime. And they're all too willing to point out hypocrisy in US and other requests that they become responsible, and they don't like the idea. I mean, if you talk to the Indians, as we have, they say, we've been very responsible, thank you. We didn't invade a country without a UN Security Council mandate say. So they're very little prickly about the entire topic. So we're going to see a lot of ongoing debates on normative or moral or value-based issues, principled issues, I think. Like, what's the correct balance between states and markets? What are the proper foundations of political legitimacy, domestic political legitimacy, and what are the boundaries of sovereignty. This question of sovereignty is a big one. Within the West, there's been a lot of movement towards a doctrine of so-called contingent sovereignty in recent years. The notion that if a country violates its fundamental obligations, say by sponsoring terrorism or pursuing weapons of mass destruction against its legal obligations, or most probably profoundly, if it makes war on its own people, that somehow it loses its presumption against intervention. And you see this in the so-called doctrine of the responsibility to protect, which I think most of you are probably familiar with. Those remain incredibly controversial statements amongst most developing world countries, major emerging economies, even those that are democracies. So we'll see a huge amount of resistance for South Africa to say anything about what goes on in Zimbabwe, or India and Brazil and China to say anything about the situation in Burma. And I just think we're going to have to live with that. Cooperation, I think, is going to be especially difficult between the United States and authoritarian powers on these questions. And the future sort of the internet and cybersecurity is a case in point. I mean, neither China nor the United States wants, presumably, criminals to run rampant over the internet. The difficulty is that the U.S. has a vision of an open, global, and relatively anonymous internet. And that collides with the Chinese vision, which is predicated on state control, including the censorship and persecution of dissidents. It's hard to imagine how you could possibly get a global governance regime on the basis of those differences. So the upshot of all this, I think, is that you are going to have a lot of more tolerance for diversity in the world that we're going to face. I just want one more line about emerging powers. It is becoming apparent that emerging powers are much more willing or much more interested in enjoying the privileges than shouldering the burdens of power. I think that partly that's because they're developing countries or self-described developing countries. And they say to themselves, look, and they say to others, we have an enormous percentage of our population in Brazil, in India, in China that are living under less than $2 a day or less than $3 a day. We need to make our contribution to global governance is actually getting wealthy. And then they're very, very disinclined to assume any obligations, for instance, on climate change, that could in any way imperil their economic trajectory. And so, even when they're granted a seat at the table, it's unclear that they're actually going to want to pick up the check. And here, I think, a common commitment to democracy does not really necessarily help. In fact, I think the tumultuous politics of major emerging country democracies can actually exacerbate tensions with the United States and other countries in the developing world. If you think back to last spring, there was this big contretemps between the United States on the one hand and Turkey and Brazil on the other, when they came up with a last-minute gambit to try to block the Fourth Security Council resolution against Iran. And that, I think, was testified to the fact that some countries get political mileage out of, some leaders, even in democracies, get political mileage out of actually standing up to the United States and sometimes adopting anti-American positions. There was a lot that went into that, but more generally, I think that these countries within, many of these big emerging countries, within broad frameworks like the UN General Assembly or the Human Rights Council, you would think that these big democracies would line up with the United States. But the fact is that many of them are still very much in the thrall of post-colonial ideologies and legacies, developing world solidarity, et cetera. And from a US perspective, they work within their caucuses and play to the galleries in a way that, and adopt sort of Western positions in a way that doesn't really make that much sense necessarily for their own interests in some ways, but also but complicates the U.S. effort to try to get what it wants. And President Obama, when he spoke at the UN General Assembly, he bemoaned this, and he said, can't we get rid of these old blocs? But so far, we haven't seen much effort to try to get rid of these caucuses. Now, I do want to mention two areas, I think, where I think you could try to you could actually try to integrate rising powers. Just two very briefly. I think one of them that has the potential is the G20. Because the G20 is one of the most profound changes in global governance, probably since, certainly since the end of the Cold War. Because it's for the first time, it actually brings in the world's major, it's the only forum that brings in the world's major established and major emerging economies at the leaders level at a position of basically at least formal equality. And that potentially can shake things up because granted a seat in the inner sanctum, it's possible that some of the attitudes of the major emerging economies will actually change, and you actually get to see a greater diplomatic fluidity. You might be able to get better and more candid debates about what's the responsibility of being a great power, and you also might get an opportunity to say, hey, let's not only think about what we need to do in this informal institution, this informal consultative mechanism, but maybe we can take some ideas we have here back into places like the United Nations and help improve the way that they do things, or back into the World Bank and help the way they do things. So there's the G20, I think, has a major possibility. The other is the UN Security Council, and I recently co-authored a report that's available on the web on UN Security Council enlargement and U.S. national interests. Now, it's fair to say that there is not a lot of desire, has not been a lot of desire amongst any U.S. administration to take this bull by the horns, right? Because there are questions about whether or not, beyond the question of whether or not the United States could do it or lead it effectively, there are questions as to whether or not any enlargement of the UN Security Council would actually be in U.S. national interest. I think that there's a strong practical and geopolitical argument for doing so, particularly because the major aspirants to permanent or long-term membership are all democracies. Now, as I said, democracies don't always agree with one another. But if one could imagine a UN Security Council augmented by Germany and Japan, which would largely side with the United States in almost every circumstance, and Brazil and India, which would side with the United States on many circumstances, then it's at least a wash, particularly if they don't have vetoes. At the same time, by bringing those countries in, you are investing them with responsibility, and there is my sense that it will help socialize them to take a more global approach to their views. And as you know, President Obama, in November, when he went to visit New Delhi, did signal U.S. support for an eventual UN Security Council seat for India. But I think any expansion of the UN Security Council should not be automatic, and for the simple reason that the behavior of those countries once they get on is a little bit hard to predict immediately. And so I think there has to be some criteria set out. And in the report that I co-wrote, I go through a bunch of criteria which one might want to use to assess how to bring these new countries in. Sixth and finally, I just want to turn to the a major hurdle for global governance reform and for creating a new, in a sense, world order. And that'll bring this discussion back home to the United States. In effect, the one country that has the best chance to serve as the motor for global governance reform, and that's the United States, remains deeply ambivalent and often selective in its approach to international institutions and multilateral cooperation. I mean, historically, as I've suggested, no country has done as much to create the global infrastructure that we have out there today. It is made in the United States. At the same time, few countries have been quite as sensitive to perceived restrictions on their freedom of action or so jealous in guarding their sovereign prerogatives. And this ambivalence that the United States has towards multilateral cooperation stems from at least three main factors. The first is the still quite impressive power of the United States, which gives us many more bilateral, unilateral, and ad hoc options than many other countries enjoy. If you're Belgium, you're probably a multilateralist. If the United States, maybe not so much. The second is America's distinctive political culture and exceptionalist traditions, particularly its insistence amongst some branches of exceptionalist thought on untrammeled sovereignty, which often translates, when it comes to treaties, into exemptionalism. The idea that treaties and international instruments should bind others, but the United States, for a number of different reasons, for its constitutional traditions, et cetera, should remain exempt from that. The third, which plays into that, is the constitutional separation of powers, which is a problem, it's not a problem, but it's an obstacle that does not exist in most other countries. where if you have a parliamentary majority, you're good to go, right? The supermajority for treaties, in particular, is a big deal. So it really can hamstring or at least constrain the U.S. assumption of obligations, as the founders no doubt wanted it to. A special word on Congress. I mean, under the Constitution, the president obviously has huge leeway in terms of the conduct of foreign policy. But Congress is not powerless. It has the power of the purse. It has the power of advice and consent over treaties. It has the power to have oversight and launch investigations. And all these allow its will to be felt very strongly. And in this regard, the November midterm elections have greatly complicated U.S. support for multilateral cooperation, given the widening differences, partisan differences between the two parties. The election of so many Tea Party-affiliated candidates, combined with the presence already of many conservative nationalists in the Republican Party, has reinforced a tendency of the Republican Party right now to be very committed to defending U.S. freedom of action and comfortable with the assertive exercise of power, although the Tea Party also has a sort of an isolationist aspect of things as well. By the same token, the defeat of so many centrist Democrats means that their own caucus is much more liberal. So the result is an ever-disappearing center in U.S. Politics, which reduces the scope for bipartisanship. Now, the House Republicans have already declared their determination to impose deep cuts in foreign aid and foreign assistance budgets. Interestingly, the Department of Defense's gargantuan budget appears always to be spared the axe, because whereas I would guess that there are 435 congressional districts that have either a defense installation or a defense contractor in them. I'm not sure that the State Department or USAID claims the same loyalty or constituency on Capitol Hill. But more than that, I think that there are a lot of major multilateral treaties on the administration's agenda, including the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The administration had hoped to have some sort of a cap and trade thing. All those things are basically dead and off the table in the current political environment. The new chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, has already held a lot of very critical hearings on the United Nations. And there's just much greater skepticism about international organizations. The Congresswoman, by the way, is completely right that there are huge problems with the United Nations. My own personal assessment is that the way that she is going about things, threatening to withhold funds or even to suggest that the United States should make its entire contributions to the United Nations voluntary, is quite short-sighted for a number of reasons. One of them is that other countries will just start picking and choosing themselves as well, and so you get just sort of this spiral of undercapacitating the United Nations. The other is that I think, despite the fact that there are instances of fraud and abuse within the United Nations, the United States depends on the United Nations every day in a number of extremely important ways, and one of them in particular is UN peacekeeping. The U.S. only pays about a quarter of the UN's assessed annual budget and its annual peacekeeping budget, which is roughly proportional to our share of the world's economy. But what that helps allow the United Nations right now to field the second largest deployed armed forces in the world. And those are deployed, all of those deployments are pursuant to U.S. approval within the UN Security Council, and they are a bargain for the U.S. taxpayer, because they allow us to address issues that are of importance to us for humanitarian reasons, genocide, horrible human rights situations, etc. Regional issues like in Lebanon, or desperate human misery in Haiti. We care about those things because we are right-thinking people, and we want to eliminate suffering around the world. But we don't necessarily want to put U.S. GIs there or U.S. Marines there. And so I think that when one finds pockets of cronyism or corruption within the United Nations, one also has to think about some of the other things that we're getting that are quite a bargain, especially when one considers that I believe that the U.S. contributions to the UN's peacekeeping budget are approximately 2 weeks' worth of U.S. military operations in Afghanistan. So one has to put these things into some perspective. I'll just close by saying that in the 21st century, the success of multilateral ventures will almost always require sustained U.S. participation. But right now, it's unclear that the Obama administration and Congress are actually able to restore the necessary bipartisan consensus that it has historically permitted U.S. leadership on major multilateral initiatives since 1945. More fundamentally, I just want to close by saying that the new world we're entering, I think, is going to require some psychological adjustments from Americans. It will include the need for new openness for collective forms of leadership and allowing the leadership of others at times, as well as less frequent invocations of American exceptionalism, or at least American exemptionalism. The United States has long picked and chosen amongst multilateral treaties, institutions, and initiatives, and occasionally acted alone and opted out to preserve its national sovereignty or freedom of action. It, of course, should retain that right, but it should also be aware that what's different today is that other countries are increasingly in a position to avail themselves of the same privilege, potentially fraying the institutional fabric of world order. So I think we need to bear in mind how much others will mirror our own behavior for good or for ill. So anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, we will take some questions. We have a microphone up here and a microphone up there. If you just raise your hand, I'll pass the microphone.
So, the recent WikiLeaks scandal that happened, President Obama was quite ambiguous as to his reaction to it, but it seemed to not come down squarely on the side of internet freedom. I'm just wondering what you think things on the internet like WikiLeaks that completely increase transparency against the will of international bodies are going to affect the future world landscape.
That's a great question. You know, my first response when I read the WikiLeaks stuff was wow, those State Department guys do pretty good reporting, which didn't surprise me since I worked at the State Department in the past, although I was not a reporting officer. And it also reminded me of the old saying that a diplomat is someone who goes abroad to lie for his country. And you know, there is a certain amount of that. You know, it's unfortunate for diplomacy because diplomacy, like much of human interaction, even perhaps some of our familial relationships, occasionally depend on a certain lubricant of insincerity. So I think that, you know, in terms of, I mean, the notion of if you took sort of the WikiLeaks principle and applied it to all of your everyday interactions and thought that absolute transparency was the greatest thing in the world, I think that would be an interesting day-long experiment. It probably wouldn't last more than a day. But in terms of whether or not it should be illegal or Assange should be charged, I don't know that Assange should be charged. I think that Manning, you know, if Manning signed in a private first class, I guess, Bradley Manning, if he signed you know, if he's under oath not to divulge classified information, then obviously, you know, he has to be prosecuted if those laws are going to mean anything. I think, you know, I don't think that it damaged U.S. foreign policy all that much. I thought that the fact that it put a little pressure on some of those Middle East autocrats was a little, and showed how the hypocrisy of their behavior was a little amusing and probably high time in coming. But you know, I think that's where we're going to see more and more about it. You know, you're right. It's going to be in international institutions and other things. I think the question is whether or not it will get people to be much more secretive about what they actually put down on, you know, on electrons. And go ahead. You were saying?
I'm just wondering how much that secrecy is even a possibility now.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, from what I gather, at the State Department, they've gone to a lot of principles-only type meetings where no flies on the wall and things like that. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. It's an open question. Yes, sir.
Given the fact that it looks like the world is not going to be able to get together to do anything coherent about global warming, the future to me looks quite bleak in this area. I'd like to hear your view on this.
Yes, you know, the projections are quite scary in terms of particularly upper bounds of climate change. You know, as in all sort of major perturbations, there will be probably some areas of you know, that come out slightly better, but the implications for you know, ocean acidification, for desertification, for human migration as a result of it, potential, you know, huge changes in weather and rainfall, meteorological patterns. I mean, there's just so much stuff that, I mean, and a lot of it we don't. I mean, we truly, I don't know. I'm sure specialists would know much more. You know, I think a lot of people are putting their hopes now on issues like technological change and and the hope that there'll be a much faster shifts towards you know, other forms of energy that are either that are renewables or that have much less of an impact. You know, there are a number of sort of multilateral technological partnerships going on, and there's the RED initiative for reforestation, and but the problem with a lot of these things, adaptation and mitigation around the world, is that there's a lot of money that's been pledged to them, but not a lot of money that's been delivered yet. And so there's an open question as to whether these sort of stopgap measures are actually going to be fully funded. But I agree with you; it's a reasonably bleak picture right now.
The top three global economic powers are in this APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. I wonder if there is any room for the United States to facilitate the engagement of the other two economic powers like China and Japan to shoulder our responsibility globally.
Possibly. I mean, in the United States for a while, I mean, there's been a disjunction in U.S. attitudes towards East Asia, and it continues, although the Obama administration, I think, is beginning to try to tweak it a little bit. And that is, during the Bush administration, I think there was a lot of focus on security architecture in East Asia, and you know, how the United States would necessarily fit into that, but economically, the United States was not adapting to growing moves towards economic integration in the region. I mean, we've already been trying to work with the Chinese and in terms of shouldering some economic burdens, and one of those is on trying to get them to revalue the renminbi, and that would make it wouldn't make all of the difference, but it certainly would reduce some competitive pressures and reduce some of the major global currency imbalances. We tried to get them to increase levels of domestic consumption. You know, Japan is another story. It's been so mired in, you know, a lost decade of very little growth and continued sort of political, if not instability, then turbulence and lack of sort of clear leadership there. And so it's hard to see much vigorous leadership coming from Japan on this question right now.
If I might, just a question on the U.S. dollar and
Mm-hmm.
its status, because we are a debtor nation.
Yes.
I'm interested to see how you look upon the reserve status of the U.S. dollar.
Yeah, there have been, it's an interesting question. There have been, at occasional meetings of the BRIC countries, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which don't have that much in common with each other in a lot of ways, but are certainly not an alliance. But at occasional summits, they have been proposing quite strongly that there should be a competitor to the dollar as a reserve currency the United States gets to avoid adjustment, in a sense, because of the unique nature that the dollar plays in the international economy. And these were, of course, criticisms that Charles de Gaulle made many years ago as well. And there have been proposals, including by the French President Sarkozy, who's going to be the host of this year's G20 in Cannes in November, that there should be some exploration of an alternative reserve currency. And the term Bancor, which was Keynes's idea, has been floated. Other people talk about creating larger quantities of SDRs as another currency. I mean, the truth is that there is beginning to be more pluralism in global currency reserves. There are more things denominated in euros than there used to be, for instance, or more euro holdings. But my sense is that there are that the United States dollar will remain the world reserve currency for at least the next sort of 20 years, I would say. And you've seen in crises this sort of, and even in crises that started in the United States, still a flight to the US dollar, which indicates still some market faith in its role.
With the events in the Middle East seeming to have a devolution of power more to the people of those states, how do those events impact global institutions, and how do global institutions impact those events in a constructive manner?
It may be an indirect linkage. My interpretation of the events in Egypt and Tunisia, and to some degree in Yemen and in Jordan and elsewhere, is, a great desire after great economic stultification and unrealized aspirations of youth, in particular youth in countries with great youth bulges that are where folks are graduating and have very little prospects for any sort of fulfilling or much less sustainable employment, that there is an effort to try to create a situation in which there is a more accountable political system in which individuals have greater voice and are able to actualize themselves, I guess is the way I would say it. In terms of its impact on international institutions, international institutions also often suffer from questions of accountability and of voice and legitimacy. There are a lot of fears always of, that these things are sort of controlled by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats who basically are not following the orders of their ostensible political masters, who should be the nation states that actually are the shareholders or the board members of these organizations. So I think that it may play into a broader desire for greater transparency and accountability on institutions generally. Difficulty with what international institutions can do is that, there may be certain things that some specialized UN agencies could do, and that the World Bank in particular, because it tends to be a very talented technical agency, could do in the wake of some of these political transitions. The difficulty with regional institutions is a lot more challenging, because there really aren't, that's one of the things about the region, is that there are very few, there's the Organization of the Islamic Conference, but there's no, there's a Gulf Cooperation Council, but there aren't actually local regional institutions that are in a position to do much at all in this circumstance. And of course, many of the leaders in the region are scared stiff that the same thing's going to happen to them.
I was wondering if you could talk for a minute about the 2004 Haitian coup and the environment surrounding it politically, especially in terms of the United States force removal of President Aristide in 2004.
I don't know if I have enough background information on that event to I don't think I have enough background information on that event, yeah, to be able to comment on that.
Considering the controversy surrounding an organization or agency like the IPCC, the accusations of manipulation of data, that the projections are all based on models that have been proven false in the past, and they keep changing the models, all these different issues that seem to be showing the IPCC as a political organization and not a scientific organization. What do you see for the future of international organizations that are claiming to be scientific when they often seem to be more political?
Yeah, the accusations about the IPCC were extraordinarily damaging to obviously its reputation, but also to the case of those who are firm believers in the reality and potential magnitude of climate change. My understanding is that the accusations were submitted and investigated quite thoroughly in a couple of situations, and that those accusations did not change the fundamental opinion based on numerous inputs, not just IPCC, that climate change is a reality and that it's a significant reality. You know, I think that going forward, there probably should be some independent assessment or independent auditor that's set up to ensure that the scientific process that's going into all this stuff is as value-free as possible and as objective as possible. And I'm not sure whether one would have a more robust peer review mechanism, perhaps, to become involved in that. But there's there's more detail on this particular topic that one of my colleagues did. He did a working paper for us, Josh Busby, who's at the University of Texas, Austin, which reviews the evidence for and against IPCC in a pretty, I thought, objective way. And it's, I think it's called Climate Change Post-Copenhagen. But anyway, it's on the Council on Foreign Relations website. The guy's name is Josh Busby, and that would provide more chapter and verse as to what the ramifications of that were and what some of the corrective actions were that were taken. That have more detail than I'm aware of.
Time for one more question.
You mentioned in your talk that we would have to perhaps tolerate more diversity. Americans would have to accept more diversity in our view of the world. And I'm wondering if you're suggesting that we're going to have to turn a blind eye to human rights violations in order to achieve progress in other areas.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I have a constant debate about this actually with my colleague Charlie Kupchan, who's a wonderful writer and thinker. He also teaches at Georgetown University, and he is very strong, much more strong than I am on this point, that he believes that regime type, that is the domestic political form of governance, is increasingly, we're going to have to leave it aside increasingly, because we're going to inhabit a world in which there are full democracies, quasi-democracies, and non-democracies, and that in engaging, for instance, China or Russia on a whole suite of global issues, hammering them on human rights is counterproductive. I don't take it as strongly as that, and I'm not just talking about regime type and human rights violations. I think that the world is headed into, the analogy I used was sort of the concert of Europe in a way, after 1815, where you needed to have cooperation amongst the great European powers of that time, and you basically had two liberal, relatively, in the era, liberal Western states, France and Britain, but then you also had the monarchies of Austria-Hungary, Prussia and Russia, who were the Holy Alliance. And so they had to, in a sense, they put certain things aside to be able to cooperate with each other on stuff that was also very important. Now, we obviously don't live in that sort of a world anymore, so that's a very imperfect analogy. But I think that in terms of domestic economic models, for a while there was all the Washington Consensus, everybody was doing the same thing, right? Now there's a lot of sort of state capitalism, a lot of interventionism in different ways. The United States is probably a little bit of an outlier in some ways. So when I talk about pluralism, I'm also talking about what's the nature of state-society relations or state-market relations. Issues of what should be our attitude towards sovereignty and, to some degree, regime type. I mean, I personally believe the United States should always be in the business of promoting human rights. It's always a question of what trade-offs you make in that regard.
Well, of course, I'm particularly thinking about the rights of women under some of these more repressive regimes in the Middle East.
I agree. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that the Obama administration, I mean, for my taste, the Obama administration came into office, very soft pedaling, too soft pedaling. There's an overreaction of the perceived excesses of the Bush years, the freedom agenda that was propounded by George W. Bush, that I think that they decided we just don't want to hector. But I think you can overdo that too, because if you don't put it on the agenda and you don't make a point of saying it's important to us, then you make the point that it's not important to you. Yeah. So I tend to agree with you. Thanks, guys.
I'm not getting back up there.
Okay. See, I don't know if I can get down from up here. Thanks, guys. It was fun.
If you want to ask us more questions. Actually, there will be a book signing outside if you're at all interested in his book, which I have here, The Best Laid Plans. Thank you so much. That was very, very interesting.
Thank you very much.